positive emotion is associated with movement forward. Like if you're where you want to be and things are going well, then your behavior should be activated so that you go and get things. Now, one of the negative consequences of that is that if you're really in a good mood, really happy, you're going to be impulsive and make mistakes. You know, because you hear these dough-headed, that's a very minor word, people who are always pushing happiness as the key measure for successful existence. It's so ill-informed that it's embarrassing that that even happens. Positive emotion makes people impulsive. Maniacs, for example, which is really, that's mania, right? Bipolar disorder. If you're manic, you're one happy person. Way too happy. Everything is great. Nothing but wonderful things that are beyond your imagination are going to happen to you. And they're going to happen fast. And so you're down to the mall to buy everything you can possibly get your hands on because you have 100 uses for everything. And then a week later, you know, you crash into your depressive episode and you realize that you're $150,000 in debt and you've alienated everyone that you know. It's like that's untrammeled positive emotion. So how about no? A pure index of positive emotion is no way of determining whether or not a system is working properly, even your own system. You need a balance between positive and negative emotions. Plus, positive emotions are absolutely exhausting because if you're in a manic episode, it's like, it's time to get everything good right now. Fine, but you won't sleep for a week and then you die because you just burned yourself to a crisp. And so to be overwhelmingly enthusiastic about everything sounds like a real blast, and I've seen full-blown manics and they're having plenty of fun, but it is not a pleasant thing to behold. They're just all over the place. And, you know, yeah, it's really not good. It's really not good. You need a balance between these two systems because the whole world isn't explored territory bursting with nothing but promise. That's not the world. The world is that in a bounded space, a little bit, with an absolute horror show going out around the periphery. And both systems need to be active in order to keep you balanced. People do, unfortunately, sustain damage sometimes to the left prefrontal cortex, responsible for positive emotion, or the right prefrontal cortex, responsible for negative emotion. And if you sustain right hemisphere prefrontal damage, it makes you inappropriately happy and impulsive, and your life just goes, you just spiral downhill. Because you make nothing but impulsive decisions, and you know what the real-world consequence of that is, you know. You get drunk and be impulsive for one night, you can learn what the bloody consequences of that are. You try living like that for a month, independently of IQ. That's the other thing that's so interesting. You can blow out your left prefrontal cortex and not suffer much of a decrease, especially in crystallized intelligence. Positive emotion is going to auger you right into the ground. And then if you're perhaps even more unlucky, and you lose the left prefrontal cortex, then you're permanently depressed. Because there's nothing but the unexplored manifesting itself. We know that if you take depressed people and you do EEG analysis, that they have predominant resting right hemisphere EEG activation. And so that's roughly, so why is this? Well, unknown territory, known territory. You think, well, is that real? Well, it's real enough, so that's how your brain evolved. That seems pretty damn real.
Well, you see too that often people who are tried by fire discover the deepest association with meaning precisely under those conditions. And that is analogous to the vision of the crucifix, let's say, that you have to go deep into the darkness and perhaps hopefully voluntarily before you can see the brightest of all possible lights. And so this idea that, part of the problem is, if you provide your children with everything, which you could do as a wealthy parent, let's say, you deprive them of deprivation, you deprive them of adventure, you deprive them of destiny, and you remove from them the necessity of grappling in a manner that really does make life meaningful. One of the things that I've really noticed in my tours, this has been extremely interesting and heartening, is that whenever I talk about the nexus between responsibility and meaning, the audiences always go dead silent. They're pretty silent during most of the discussions, but that particularly brings a hush to everyone, because it's not a message that people are receiving anymore. It's like, okay, life is suffering and malevolence in its essence, in some undeniable sense. It may not be only that, but it is undeniably also that. And so you need a sustaining meaning to tide you over while you're suffering and while you're betrayed. And then the question is, well, where's the most reliable place to find that meaning? And one answer is, well, hedonism, and another answer might be cynicism and anarchism and that sort of wild life that goes along with throwing off all constraints. And there's some attraction to that. But more fundamentally, if you watch how people actually respond in times of crisis, they find that the responsibilities that they've undertaken in the past to form friendships, to form intimate relationships, to clean up their family and establish tight bonds, to take on some major burden and make sacrifices in their life, that's where they get all the meaning. Hedonism doesn't work technically. Like, we looked at the effect of positive emotion on decision making. Okay, so to pursue hedonism is to suppress negative emotion, let's say, but also to pursue positive emotion. And those can be technically differentiated neurologically and psychologically, conceptually. They're completely separate systems. They're mutually inhibitory. They run on different biochemical pathways. What happens when you're hedonically, when you're in the midst of a hedonic experience? And the answer is, you get short-term and impulsive. And a lot of the pure operation of the hedonic system is short-term impulsivity. And so the pathology of hedonism, technically, is mania. And it's the counterpart to depression, let's say. And manic people, they want to do everything at once and they're unbelievably impulsive. And so they can't make good decisions. And you might say, well, if your philosophy is hedonic, then whatever makes you happiest is a good decision. But then you see pathologies of hedonism that produce impulsivity. And the way out of that is to recognize that it's sacrifice that's the right replacement for hedonism. You might say, well, I should be self-centered. We talked about this earlier. It's like, well, do you mean the self that is going to drink a quart of vodka tonight and then be hungover tomorrow? Or do you mean the self that's going to sustain itself wisely and carefully over a 40-year period, let's say in a properly sustaining marriage? And so it isn't even hedonism. It's narrow, impulsive, immature, 2-year-old hedonism. And that is not a solution.
This is why there are no convincing movies about heaven, because our hedonism has generated this notion of heaven as supernatural hedonic pleasure. Whether it's the beatific vision or music or golden streets or whatever, we're bored by that. That's not it. We don't know what it is, but that's certainly not what it is. Problem of boredom goes deeper than we think.
Well, in Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky nails this too, because he says, and it's so brilliant, he's criticizing the Palace of Crystal, which was a building built in the UK for the World's Fair, and it was the first modernist building, and it was this image of technological utopia and material plenty, which the Marxists push as well. And Dostoevsky said, well, what's wrong with this materialist utopian vision? And he says it so brilliantly with his bitter and cynical character. He says, if you set up human beings so they had nothing to do but lie around in warm pools of water and busy themselves with the propagation of the race and eat cakes nonstop, so the land of milk and honey in the narrowest possible sense, the first thing that we would do is set about the place, smashing it up, just so something unpredictable could happen so that we would have our adventure. And I read that and I thought, man, that's so deadly right, is that he said human beings are ungrateful and we can curse. It's the primary thing that separates us from animals. And that it's related to the idea of eating the fruit in the garden of paradise, is that we are made for a challenge. We are made for an adventure. We're not made for this kind of narrow and local hedonism. It's demeaning and it's counterproductive. And it isn't rich in the face of tragedy and malevolence. It's a bad solution.